Marcus gripped the steering wheel as he drove through the unfamiliar streets, his mind racing with a mix of emotions. The city stretched before him, tall buildings, busy sidewalks, and houses that would soon become familiar. Beside him, Jasmine stared out the window, taking in every detail. This wasn't just another move. It was a fresh start, a chance to leave behind the struggles they had endured for years. For Marcus, this move meant more than just unpacking boxes. It was proof that they had finally made it past the barriers life had thrown at them. He wanted to believe things would be different here. Better. But as they passed a police car parked on the corner, something felt off. The officers inside weren't just watching the road, they were watching him. The uneasy feeling settled in his chest. He had seen that look before, and he knew exactly what it meant. As Daniel continued driving, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The police car was still there, parked at the corner, but the officers inside weren't just glancing at traffic, they were staring straight at him. Their eyes followed his car, filled with something he recognized all too well. Suspicion. His pulse quickened, but he kept his expression calm. Beside him, Mia was still looking out the window, unaware of the silent tension growing inside him. He didn't want to alarm her, but deep down, he already knew what was coming. Then, the flashing red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. The sharp wail of the siren cut through the quiet evening. "Pull over!" A voice boomed through the loudspeaker. Daniel let out a slow breath, gripping the steering wheel tighter. His heart pounded, frustration creeping in. Seriously? Again? He hadn't done anything wrong. He quickly glanced at Mia, who was already tense, then signaled and eased the car to the side of the road. The moment he stopped, both officers jumped out of their vehicle. Their movements were fast, rigid, too eager. Daniel swallowed hard as they approached. He had been through this before, and he knew exactly what was about to happen. The looks on their faces, the way they carried themselves, it wasn't just about a routine stop. It was something else. Something he had learned to recognize from a lifetime of experience. The two officers marched toward Daniel's car with stiff, confident strides. Their expressions weren't neutral. They were filled with something Daniel had seen too many times before. Arrogance. Prejudice. A belief that they were in control before they even spoke a word. The older officer, a tall man with a square jaw and cold eyes, stopped just outside Daniel's window. He didn't bother with a greeting. Instead, he held out his hand expectantly. "License and registration." "Now," he ordered, his voice sharp and impatient. Daniel kept his face calm, even as his stomach twisted. He had done nothing wrong, yet he knew that wouldn't matter. Arguing wouldn't help. Neither would frustration. He had to play this carefully. "Sure, officer," he said smoothly, reaching for his wallet. He handed over his documents, watching as the officer snatched them up without a second glance. The man flipped through them quickly, barely reading, his expression never changing. The second officer, younger but just as smug, leaned against the car door with crossed arms. "Where are you coming from?" he asked, his tone laced with doubt. Daniel met his eyes. "We're moving here," he answered evenly, refusing to show any irritation. The younger officer smirked, shaking his head. "Moving, huh? Where to?" He glanced at Mia, his gaze lingering a little too long, filled with something unspoken but clear. Daniel clenched his jaw but didn't react. He knew the game they were playing. It wasn't about where he was going. It was about who he was. Or, more accurately, who they thought he was. The older officer flipped through Daniel's documents again, his eyes narrowing as if something didn't add up. He didn't bother looking at Daniel, just kept scanning the papers like he was searching for a reason to be suspicious. Then, without looking up, he spoke. "This your car?" His voice was flat, but the meaning behind his words was anything but. Daniel kept his expression steady, though he could feel the weight of the accusation. "Yes." "Is there a problem?" The officer finally looked at him, a slow smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Nice ride. Just seems a little out of place for someone like you." Daniel's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. He knew exactly what the officer meant. Mia's breathing grew shallow beside him, but before she could say anything, he gave her a small, reassuring squeeze of the hand. The younger officer walked around the car, taking his time. Then, without warning, he tapped on Mia's window. "Step out," he ordered, not even sparing Daniel a glance. Mia hesitated, looking at Daniel. He gave her a small nod, knowing they had no choice. Slowly, she opened the door and stepped out. The younger officer immediately began searching her, an unnecessary, humiliating act meant to prove a point. Daniel kept his mouth shut, his jaw clenched. This wasn't just a random stop. It was something more. The officers weren't looking for a reason to let them go. They were looking for a reason to make them stay. And Daniel had a sinking feeling they weren't going to stop until they found one. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tightly, forcing himself to stay calm as the officers continued their so-called inspection. The younger officer finished searching Mia and stepped back, giving her a look that made Daniel's blood boil. "You two got anything illegal on you?" the older officer asked, his tone dripping with fake concern. He wasn't really asking, he was waiting for an excuse. Daniel's jaw clenched. "No, we don't." The officer chuckled under his breath, flipping through Daniel's papers without actually reading them. "A guy like you, driving a car like this? Yeah, I find that hard to believe." Mia balled her fists at her sides, but Daniel subtly shook his head, telling her to stay quiet. He'd been through this before. He knew that anything they said would be twisted against them. The younger officer walked to the back of the car and popped open the trunk without permission. Daniel could hear him rummaging through their belongings. "Moving, huh?" the officer called out mockingly. "Doesn't look like you packed much." Daniel took a deep breath. "We packed enough." The older officer stepped closer, his smirk widening. "Here's the thing. People like you always have something to hide." Daniel's patience was wearing thin, but he knew better than to react. That's what they wanted, for him to snap, to give them an excuse. He wouldn't give them that satisfaction. "We're moving," Daniel repeated, his voice firm but controlled. "There's no reason for this stop." The officer tilted his head, amused. "I see plenty of reasons." The younger officer slammed the trunk shut and walked back, arms crossed. "Yeah, and I think we're gonna need to take a closer look." Daniel exhaled slowly. He knew this wasn't over. Daniel felt his patience slipping as the officers continued their so-called inspection. The older officer leaned against the car, arms crossed, smirking like he had already decided Daniel was guilty of something. "You seem nervous," the officer said, his voice mocking. "That a problem?" Daniel forced himself to stay calm. "I just don't see why we're being stopped." The younger officer scoffed, stepping closer. "That's not your concern. We ask the questions, you answer. Now, why don't you tell us what you're really doing here?" Daniel met his eyes without flinching. "I already told you. We're moving." The older officer chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah? Doesn't add up. People like you always got something going on." Mia shifted uncomfortably beside the car, her hands clenched into fists. Daniel saw the frustration in her face, but he knew they had to be careful. The younger officer walked around the car, glancing at Mia like she was part of the interrogation. "So, what's your story?" he asked, his tone laced with fake politeness. Mia's jaw tightened. "We're moving." The officer smirked. "That's cute. But I don't buy it." Daniel took a slow breath, gripping the steering wheel tighter. He had been through situations like this before, where the rules didn't matter, only the power they held over him. The older officer leaned in slightly. "Let's make this simple. Get out of the car." Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. He couldn't afford to escalate things. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out. Mia's worried eyes followed him. The younger officer cracked his knuckles. "Good. Now, let's see what else you're hiding." Daniel knew this was far from over. Daniel kept his breathing steady, even as the tension thickened. The older officer stood in front of him, arms crossed, a smug grin on his face. The younger one hovered nearby, clearly waiting for any excuse to act. "You think this is unfair?" The older officer sneered. "Maybe you've got something to hide." Daniel met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "I know my rights. You have no reason to keep us here." The younger officer scoffed. "Oh, yeah? And what makes you think you're in charge here?" Daniel didn't blink. Slowly, he reached into his jacket pocket, Instantly, both officers stiffened, their hands darting toward their weapons. "Hey, hey! What do you think you're doing?" The older officer snapped. Daniel didn't rush. With deliberate, controlled movements, he pulled out his badge and held it up for them to see. The effect was instant. The smirks vanished. Their confidence cracked like shattered glass. The younger officer blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing without words. The older one's jaw tightened. "What? What is this?" The younger officer stammered. Daniel stepped forward, his voice firm. "My name is Daniel Carter, and I'm the new chief of police for this district." A thick silence settled over the scene. The officers looked at each other, suddenly pale. We didn't know," the older officer muttered, scrambling for an excuse. "This was just a misunderstanding," Daniel cut him off. "No. This was abuse of power. And you're going to be held accountable." Maya stepped closer, watching the officers squirm. For the first time that night, the two men realized this wasn't just another stop. This was the end of their unchecked authority.